Hello, you're listening to the Haaretz podcast. I'm Amir Tibon, filling in this week for Ellison Kaplan-Sommer. On today's episode, we'll start in Gaza, where things have been somewhat more quiet over the past 2 weeks. But difficult questions remain, like, for example, when will Israel finally allow international journalists into the Palestinian enclave to cover the impact of the war? Then we'll shift to settler violence in the West Bank. We'll ask why Israeli authorities are failing to stop this terrible phenomenon and, in many cases, even helping the perpetrators. We'll hear about a recent Haaretz report from the South Hebron Hills about this subject. All that and much more coming up in a second. Our first guest today is Peter Lerner. He's Director General for International Relations at Israel's largest union, the Histadrut. But Peter, you're joining us a bit in what I would call your previous hat, one perhaps more recognizable to Haaretz readers and listeners. You were the foreign media spokesperson for the IDF. You did it a while ago, and then you joined after October 7, and for many months, everybody watching the news from Israel and the news about the war in Gaza could see you on many different channels all over the world. Thank you for coming on the podcast today.
It's great to be back.
Well, I think that the last time we spoke, we did an article, I think it was maybe 7 or 8 months into the war after October 7, just after you had left the military, and we analyzed the complete failure of the Israeli government in explaining the goals and the aims of the war to a wider international audience. And I don't think anything has gotten better on that front ever since.
I would say, on the contrary, the situation has only got worse. I would say at that stage, we were very critical of the politicians that were continuously hyperboling, talking endlessly, really crazy
Nuking
themes
Gaza,
and ideas, all of these types of things.
Sending away all the population.
I think those have, except for the last, the campaigning for political needs towards the elections now, there has been some certain level of responsibility, but it was too late. I think the situation was way already in its path, and from a communications perspective, from an engagement perspective from Israel to the world, we are isolated more than we have ever been before, and it's on the responsibility of the government.
There is a messaging issue here, but many of our listeners and readers and writers would say there's a bigger problem at hand, which is the policy that was executed for long parts of this war, and that perhaps after October 7 was viewed, at least here in Israel and by many in the world. If you look at the first weeks, Israel had strong backing from the United States and some European countries, and even quiet backing from some of the Arab world for what was described as a defensive war, but became something very different throughout 2024, certainly 2025.
The situation is as such. We cannot be hopeless about the situation. The responsibility in Israel was founded on agency of coming out of the Shoah, of building a country, of creating communities, of building a society. That hopelessness cannot lead us into a situation of helplessness. So, of course, policies need to be directed towards our strategic goal. What do we want to be as a country? And unfortunately, I would say in the last 20 years, Israel has been lacking vision of what are we going to be in the next 20 years, in the next 100 years. What is Israel
Sometimes in the next 2 years.
They very rarely have a policy that is upheld over 2 months. If you look at the situation, the promises that are made in every election cycle, and those that are actually implemented, it just reflects exactly what I'm saying. Yes, of course, there are policies that are questionable. In my experience throughout the course of my military service in reserve duty, I can say that the policies were reflective of everything I'd experienced in my 25 years of military service beforehand, not extraordinary with regard to how military conduct, military planning, and the execution of military operations. And that's why I believe, and I still believe, it's a matter of leadership, first of all, of how are we relating to the struggle that we are facing. The fact that Israelis feel that no matter what we do, the world is going to be about us is not a given. It's something that we can engage with, we can control. We need to build alliances. We need to have the functioning bodies in Israeli society, in the Israeli government, that can enable that. Because if we don't, then we're going to continue, and we're going to be in this circle of helplessness, maybe even go into a state of hopelessness, which means there's nothing we can do. We just, we'll leave it like that, and then the isolation will just get greater.
I want to ask you one more question about Gaza, and then we'll shift to the West Bank, where some dramatic things are happening today as we are recording this podcast. But just another question on Gaza, and maybe we'll come back to it later, because there's also a whole diplomatic situation evolving around Gaza right now. But we ran an article this week on Haaretz by Tagrid al-Khudari, Palestinian journalist now based in Europe. And she wrote something very critical about the fact that even now, 2.5, almost 3 years after the beginning of the war, Israel is still not allowing international journalists into Gaza. Why is that? And do you think it's time to change this policy?
Time was passed probably about 2 years ago.
If it was up to you, as someone who was in the spokesperson, leading the efforts there, you would have allowed it already 2 years ago.
And I recommended it to my superiors in the course of the war that holding out this long is not beneficial to Israel. It just superimposes the fact that people will say that you're hiding something.
She wrote in the article, Israel is not allowing journalists because Israel doesn't want coverage of war crimes and documentation of them.
Arguably, the conflict in Gaza in the last 3 years has been the most covered story in the world. So I think that is actually a weak story. It's a weak argument. I think that the fact that Israel needs to do better because we are a democratic state. I think we need to do better because this is the state of media affairs and media relations in 2026. Everybody, and this is a global phenomenon, is unable to accept criticism. If you criticize me, you're the enemy. And therefore, if it's free for all and everybody can go and do whatever they want, the fact is that there will be negative stories about the consequences of war. There are always negative consequences for war wherever they are, everywhere in the world. Now, can we be better? Absolutely. I think this was something that it was. Perhaps there was an argument at the beginning of the war, safety of journalists, the haphazardness of the battlefield, which is a challenge. We don't want journalists to be killed in the battlefield as a result of Israeli military fire. And I think that we can agree on that. On the other hand,
there have been many Palestinian journalists who have been killed over these 2.5 years.
And on the other hand, I think that like everywhere in the world, that's the journalist's decision to take that responsibility for himself, knowing if he's going to a war zone, which is a real war zone, where in the urban environment, the way Hamas organized its battlefield, beneath the houses, in the hospitals, there are literally no safe places. And we've seen that throughout the course of the war. So I'd say, yes, journalists should be allowed to go in.
Why do you think your recommendation was not approved? Is it a military decision? Is it the political rank?
There was ambivalence, I think, at the beginning from a military perspective. This was a routine reality that had resulted after Operation Cast Lead.
2009 already.
Yes, yeah. And Operation Cast Lead, journalists came and went freely, and it was an operational burden on the security in the area of Erez Crossing and so on. And after that, the government decided, in times of conflict, there'll be a hiatus. But nobody thought a war would last 3 years.
Perhaps that's the root of many of the problems.
Many. But that is exactly the essence of why it needed to be reviewed. Now, the Foreign Press Association appealed to the Supreme Court. And once it gets into the legal battlefield, then the organizations, they just put in their ankles, then they dig in, and now to change it, it means we were wrong the whole time. It's the argument of why Netanyahu could not let the Palestinian Authority go into Gaza.
After investing so many years
in Hamas, because it would
Hamas,
prove that his whole policy throughout all of the years of sidelining the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank was wrong.
Yeah. Speaking of the West Bank, we're sitting here in the studio in Tel Aviv. It's Wednesday morning, and I'm watching on my phone while we're speaking these unbelievable developments happening in some of the villages in the West Bank, Kusra, in other places in the area of Nablus, where violent extremist settlers are basically blockading Palestinian families in their homes. And that's one unbelievable element of it. But I think for me, as an Israeli citizen, as someone who served in the army and had people in my family serve for many years and still have close people to me, wearing uniform, seeing the IDF allowing this to happen and sometimes participating actively is very, very difficult. What do you think when you see these images?
So I think we need to differentiate between actively participating in policy. So there are soldiers on the ground that are part of the situation, part of the issue, and part of the problem you're describing. And then there's the policy. I think on the policy level, we have instructions which are weak and not as reinforced as they have been in the past, because of the political environment. Now, if you have Smotrich, who is effectively the minister in charge of the West Bank.
He's the commander of the West Bank today, I would argue, more even than the head of the Central Command, General Blut.
Yeah. So if you have Smotrich, who is making the guidelines, and I think more important than guidelines is political and financial support of the situation on the ground.
Of the creation of these new illegal outposts and the so-called farms that are taking up Palestinian land.
Yeah, in the name of security. And in some cases, the security establishment recognize that there is security value. They don't want to put soldiers everywhere. And if you have a forward position, then that's beneficial. Again, you have to always remember that the entire mindset of the IDF now is post-October 7th. So the scenario everybody is thinking about is a mass invasion into a community in the West Bank. And so how do we prevent that? How we do in Gaza. You push the line forward.
But Peter, what is actually happening is mass invasions of communities in the West Bank, Palestinian ones.
And this is the flip side.
And I have to say, when I watch these images of these families who are being attacked in their homes and they are so helpless, to me, as someone who experienced October 7 very, very close, it's traumatic to watch.
It's deplorable, and it has to stop. And I think that the biggest problem is the empowered elements of these extremist settlers that have all of the initiative and all of the political clout and support and finance to do it. So you can't establish a farm if you don't have water or energy or a road. These are things that the government has supported, this government has supported. And that's why it is a system that has changed extensively over the last 4 years. It's not like that these phenomena did not exist beforehand, but in the last 4 years, they
exploded.
have just been... Yeah, it's just like they were priming the situation so that when they have the power, they will just be able to rush forward.
But I do think something has changed, and here I want to make it difficult for you. And you're not in an official hat here for the IDF, and I appreciate still your commentary. I think one thing that has changed is these recurring images of the soldiers standing nearby and doing nothing as this violence is taking place.
This is something that isn't new. One of the roles I filled, I was the spokesperson for Central Command. And one of the issues we always had to deal with was the passive approach that some of the soldiers in the field took. I think that today, again, it is empowered and superimposed. Why do I need to get involved in something that maybe my commanders or the commanders' commanders or if Ben-Gvir will call me up and say, what are you doing? And this is a situation.
That's the soldier asking, why should I get in trouble over this?
Why do I need to? What business is it of mine? Now, I would say, as a former, military official, as a lieutenant colonel in the IDF, I would say, it is your responsibility to do things that are uncomfortable to you, because that's your responsibility. It's your professional responsibility. And yes, of course, if the military guidelines are clear, the soldier knows what to do. If they're ambivalent, he will choose the easy out.
So this is a failure in the tactical sense of the IDF leadership.
It filters down. It's this waterfall effect that if I don't do anything, as in I, Avi Blut, don't do anything,
then the head of Central Command, yeah.
If I don't do anything, then I don't get my ears bitten off by Channel 14 and then the whole campaign and then politics. If I don't do anything, then division commander doesn't do anything, then the brigade commander doesn't do anything, the company commander doesn't do anything. At the end of the day, the soldier standing there, he's been sent there because there's a disruptance or disturbance and he thinks, why should I do it? Now, even if he's very, very professional, and even if he believes that this is something that he needs to do, the environment around him is not supportive of action. And this is, I think, in Israel of 2026, the issue of agency and accountability is lacking.
Right, it starts from the top, as you say. There is a separate issue of these military-ish forces that belong to the settlements, these regional command units, and their involvement is different. And that's something you hear all the time from Palestinians, from Israelis who are going there as activists, from reporters, and we'll hear in a minute from one of ours who was there recently to cover these events. But those locally based, militarized settlement residents, they often take a much more active role. And we saw that a few weeks ago with this incident in Tel, a village where there was this supposed field trip that became a gunfight and 6 people died, 4 Palestinians, 2 Israelis, one of them an IDF officer. That seems to be a different and, in my opinion, more serious problem.
Absolutely. The situation of armed security, which is endorsed by the military, trained by the military, and equipped by the military, empowers them even more. And again, it relates to the whole
Smotrich policy.
Puzzle of how do we govern. They said that they were going to be elected on governance. So governance is them governing what they want to do, but not really.
There is no rule of law.
Exactly.
There, yeah.
So it's a lawlessness state of reality where whoever has the biggest weapon and perhaps takes the initiative has the upper hand. Again, and it's this October 7th mindset that is motivating.
Well, I will argue, from a flip side, if we mention October 7, one of the problems on October 7 was that there were so many military forces in a specific area and not enough soldiers on the Gaza border. And I think that's another part of this conversation.
Absolutely. Maintaining defense in the West Bank is and was until October 7th the most heaviest burden on the IDF. Most of the forces, regular forces, were positioned there routinely, extensively. The focus of maintaining operational overwhelming power in that area to prevent terrorist attacks. The intelligence capabilities are extensive there. It just goes to show that the focus was there where it should have been perhaps elsewhere.
When I see these events, I fear a repeat, I have to say. I want to bring into the conversation Abby Seitz. Hi, Abby.
Hi, Amir. Thank you for having me on.
Abby is a wonderful editor at Haaretz English edition, and she wrote an important story that was published last week, together with Naram Zbidat, about these events that we've been discussing, the violence of settlers in the West Bank and the helplessness at best, and if you want to have a less generous interpretation, perhaps the assistance of Israeli authorities in allowing that violence to happen. Abby, tell us a bit about the story. Where did you go? What did you see?
Naram and I went to Al-Khair. It's in the Masafar Yatta region of the West Bank, the South Urban Hills.
That's the subject of the No Other Land documentary film.
Correct. That won at the Oscars a few years ago, yes. And we went to visit the family and friends of Auda Hathalin. He was a 30-year-old father of 3 who was killed, shot dead, on July 28th, 2025. And in the lead up to the 1-year anniversary of his death, we went down there to talk to his friends and family and to see how they were planning to commemorate his death and to see what kind of impact it's had on the community. And what we found, of course, people are still devastated. There's no words for the pain that they've been subjected to over the last year. But what we found more so was that the outpost the land was being excavated at the time that Auda was shot. It's grown into an outpost with 12 trailer homes in it now. And that's in the last year. It went up about a month after Auda's death, went up at the end of August 2025. And it's now home to multiple families. And
this is an outpost, just to be clear, that even according to Israeli law, is illegal. It's important to explain to the listeners because there is an ongoing debate about the legality of the settlements, which I think most Israelis don't care about at this point. And then most people in the world are convinced that they are all illegal. But these are places that even according to the laws of this country are illegal, and they're continuing to grow and expand. And like Peter said, with the support of the government. What about the security situation and the level of violence? Are these attacks that lead to these terrible incidents like the one you went to write about, are these attacks continuing?
Yes, they're absolutely continuing. And Al-Khair, like most Palestinian communities, is surrounded by both a settlement and this newer outpost. There's always been home demolitions, settler violence in Al-Khair and other communities in the South Hebron Hills, but it has escalated like crazy since this outpost was put up. It's between homes. It splits the village in half. It blocks the way to school.
When you go there, how are you received as a reporter for Haaretz?
Well, Khair is unique in that it's probably the place in the West Bank, if I had to guess, besides Ramallah, that has hosted the most people from around the world and from a variety of countries, not
A
just
lot of
U.S.
activists,
Jews
journalists.
on trips. Yes, absolutely. And also faith and diplomatic leaders from around the world. It's been the case for some time, since before Aldo was killed, that if you went to visit Khair, within 2 minutes, police or army or Khagmar, which is
The settler units we discussed, yes.
Yes, they'll show up. And that happened when Naram and I went to Khair in the second weekend of July. It was actually Bedouin soldiers doing their regular service. Naram was able to identify that from their accents in Arabic because when we emerged from the community center and went to go meet the soldiers, they were telling residents that they had come to investigate. The settlers had called and said that nails were put down on the road connecting the settlement of Carmel with the outpost. And it turned out it was there almost every night. There's brawls over there's a barbed wire fence surrounding the outpost, and it was from the
fence being broken.
Exactly. Yeah. These soldiers told us to stop recording. I was 10 feet away, not up in their face. They told us to stop recording, and they told Naram in Arabic that if we kept recording and we didn't listen, they were going to find her in Sakhnin and find her family.
Sakhnin is a town in Israel,
Correct.
In Galilee, where her family is from.
Correct. Like me, Naram is an Israeli citizen, and first of all, we had the right to film. That's already a bit of a press access issue, but it's outlandish that regular duty soldiers, these aren't the Khagmar, the reservist squads that we've been talking about. These are regular soldiers. And that was also the case that day. We also visited a Palestinian town called Turkomia. It's about 12 kilometers northwest of Hebron, and it's almost all entirely Area B. The surrounding agricultural lands are Area C.
Explain the distinction to our listeners. Some may not be familiar with it.
So in Area A, this is all per the Oslo Accords. In Area A, it's full Palestinian security and civil control. And then in Area B, it's split. So with Israeli security control with Palestinian civil control over local municipal matters. And then Area C is full Israeli civil and security control. When we were leaving Turkomia, the soldiers and police both were there. They told us that it was Area A, which is not correct, and that we were not authorized to be there even if we both had press credentials that we showed. And then they also incorrectly said that I had been previously warned to not be in Area A, which is not true. This is not uncommon, and it's increasingly happening against journalists. It's increasingly happening against international Israeli journalists, but it's also been happening against Palestinian journalists for a long time. There are Palestinian journalists right now. They're in administrative detention in the West Bank. Some of them have been held for months and months and months without charges, and it's simply for filming what's been going on.
In some of these communities?
Yeah, all over the West Bank. There isn't a part of the West Bank right now that isn't suffering from cellular violence.
And what did you hear from the military when you reached out for comment about this behavior?
Naram reached out for comment, and she was told they selectively answered the questions, so they more provided us statements on some closed military zone orders and things that the residents had brought up. They did not comment on those two specific incidents. I will say that when we reached out to Israel police for comments on the dispersal of a memorial ceremony on July 28th, 2026, 1 year to the day that Aldo was shot dead, the police told us soldiers and border police had been dispersed to Khair. They told us it was quote-unquote to disperse an unlawful gathering, which was intended to serve as a demonstration of support for a terrorist who was neutralized and killed approximately 1 year ago. And they're referring to Aldo Hathalin, who, you can watch No Other Land. You can read many testimonies have been published by his friends and his family in media around the world. It was shocking to receive that kind of response, because anyone who had met Aldo or anyone who has visited Khair
or just watched and read about his work.
Absolutely. He was dedicated to nonviolence, not only as a political ideology or as some kind of shtick, but it was truly the essence of how he lived his life and how the people there in Al-Khair have agreed to live their lives. There's, exactly like Peter was talking about, there's a huge lack of accountability. And it's really troubling that the police, the army, and the state are all able to contradict each other, because only a few days after that memorial ceremony was dispersed, the state prosecutor's office in Israel, they indicted Yinon Levi, the man that multiple videos from multiple angles showed shooting Auda dead. They indicted him for manslaughter.
So if he killed a supposed terrorist, why is he being indicted? And that's just such a Kafkaesque situation. And if it wouldn't be so terribly tragic, one could laugh about it, but actually it makes you want to cry, because, this just such an absurd situation. Peter, you're listening to this.
This is a zoom in on a much broader phenomena that I think that is generally overlooked in Israel. I think this is the biggest problem we have, that except for Haaretz and some sporadic reporting on in the broader channel, in the TV channels or something
Barely
like that,
touch it today.
It's barely covered. It's like this non-issue unless there is a very serious political ramification. And I think this is the failure of Israeli society of not knowing and or not wanting to know what is happening by our soldiers, by our police force, in our name. And I think this is the shame of it. At the end of the day, we send our sons and daughters to the front lines. We need to give them the moral tools as well as the professional tools to uphold the principles of ethics of the military. And when there are failures, it needs to be dealt with. And I think this is the problem what we're finding ourselves, and it relates to what we were talking about beforehand. But I think this is a year we are in. The 2026 is a substantial year for regaining that agency. And I would say anybody that is putting forward a platform for 27th of October to be re-elected, they need to say, what is Israel's agency with regard to the Palestinian arena? What type of direction are we going to have? What is the vision in 1, 2, 5, 10 years? What is the vision for Gaza? What is the vision with Iran? What is the vision with the Jewish diaspora? There is so much that relates to just this, from this story, how we go up and see where we are now at the edge of this cliff.
Peter, you're talking about a future trajectory. I want to ask you, Abby, because this has not been your first visit to these areas of the West Bank. What is the trajectory that you are seeing compared to visits in previous years? What has changed on the ground? And you mentioned the outpost growing. What else?
Well, I want to clarify that some of the time I've spent in the West Bank, especially prior to coming to Haaretz last year, was as a protective presence activist. I didn't do anything except show up for shifts, but I've gotten to see a lot of different communities, especially Bedouin shepherding communities, since 2018.
So that's an 8-year period to see how things are moving.
I think it's important to understand that settler violence was already displacing people prior to October 7th. There were at least 9 communities in the West Bank that were entirely forcibly displaced.
Yeah, we were covering that in the months before October 7th.
Absolutely. And now that total surpasses 65 since October 7th. And in terms of the trajectory, no one there has any hope. I mean, to be completely honest, of course, the Palestinians that live in the West Bank cannot vote in the Israeli elections, despite how much that will impact their life, their chances of survival. They are talking about the elections because they know it will impact them.
It decides them as well, yeah.
Yeah.
If Smotrich comes back for another term as the minister of the West Bank or not, for example.
Right. I want to be clear. This is happening also not only in small Bedouin hamlets that, maybe it's a few tents and a flock of sheep. No, this is happening in towns that also have a lot of wealthy Palestinian-American dual nationals.
for example.
Correct. Tormesia, Der Jarir, Mukhmas. There's people sitting in those towns that they don't know if they will be there in a year. And they're fully expecting. In Mukhmas, there was already a 19-year-old boy that was murdered in February by an Israeli settler. His friends, his cousins, his brothers, they're all expecting to die as well. They know that there's nothing coming. They know that, international intervention used to be a useful mechanism. The first place I ever visited in the West Bank and did protective presence was Khan al-Akhmar. It's a 10, 15-minute drive from my house in Western Jerusalem. That's an example of a place that was saved by international intervention.
Mostly, I think the German government, Merkel at the time, put a hard stop on that and said, don't evacuate that place. And it's still there today.
Right. But I mean, I visit destroyed communities and there's still signs from the EU or from the 12 different European countries that came together, put together a fund for a toilet, and now it's sitting there demolished.
So you think that's a big change, that the international community, if that thing even exists, but countries that have relations with Israel, organizations, they're not a deterrent anymore.
No, absolutely not. And even in the time, like I said, it's been 8 years since I started doing protective presence. The usefulness of protective presence and even the dynamics of it they were already changing before October 7th. That spring was the first time that communities I knew asked for 24/7 presence instead of just during the day to take the sheep out. And it's obviously only gotten so much worse since then.
Peter, the incident at Tel a few weeks ago, which made a lot of headlines, I think it was unique because it was the first time that one of these tense situations, to say the least, led to an explosion, an exchange of gunfire, and you had 6 people killed. And when I'm watching these events and when I'm hearing the hopelessness, the despair that Abby is describing, what I'm thinking of is at some point there will be a counter attack and we will see the West Bank basically set on fire because of this situation, which it seems like the government, the military have totally lost control over.
I mean, that's a relevant question. And Israel has always been asking itself, when is the West Bank going to explode? The question is there the energy? Is there the organization for that? And how effective is the defense establishment in making sure that it doesn't happen? The motivations, I'm sure, exist. I mean, you will see military operations that are taking place almost every night anyway to conduct arrests and detention of suspects who potentially are involved in planning perhaps because of some of these grievances. But it all boils down to 4 years of superimposed sense of ownership of the settlement movement on everything that happens in the West Bank. That is the hugest, the most significant motivator for the trends. As I said, it filters over. It does mean that, in my view, these are things that are not going to change before October 27th. Will they change after October 27th? Lays on the responsibility of Israeli society of what type of country we want.
Abby, one more question to you and then one more to Peter. The people that you met for this story and for other reporting and also in the past when you were going there more as an activist, these debates we are having about 2-state solution, 1-state solution, Israel, the PA, does that seem relevant to them or completely detached from the reality?
Not at all. I've never met a Palestinian living in the West Bank that was like, hell yeah, I love the PA. Like, they're doing so much for me. That's absolutely not the case.
And that connects to what you said earlier about the disconnect between the international discourse and the events on the ground. Because if you talk to people in Brussels or in Washington, that's still the language that they're talking about. But you're saying people on the ground don't see any of that.
No, because they're in survival mode fully. I mean, I'd also like to clarify that there are plenty of protective presence activists. The majority of them are not from Israel's radical left. Even Rabbi Arik Asherman, who organizes a lot of these shifts, both of his kids just got out of the army. There's protective presence activists that answered the call after October 7th to go to Gaza or to Lebanon.
And then came back to activism in the West Bank to protect Palestinian communities.
Specifically because they were so horrified that the IDF that they thought they knew was acting like this. And they saw that from documentation that it makes a difference if you can show up and change the dynamic a bit.
See, that's agency. That's what I was talking about.
But the problem is the reason I would call it a Gazification of the West Bank is because there's an active effort going on right now that I don't know that elections will do much of anything about to clear the West Bank of all witnesses. That includes protective presence activists, and this is...
To make it more difficult for activists, for journalists.
Activists and journalists and diplomats. Diplomatic tours get chased out and harassed just like journalists. But we're also risking the American-Jewish relationship with Israel by doing this. There have been more than a dozen U.S. Jewish activists that have been deported or had their ETA, their entry visa, revoked because they participated in some kind of West Bank activism. And again, these are completely non-violent activities.
Well, one thing we are going to do at Haaretz is continue to write about it and speak about it and bring it to people's attention. And Peter, I do want to connect the last question to what Abby just described. And your profession at the end of the day is to explain policies that are happening here in Israel to the outside world. Today you're doing it more in the labor union world with the Histadrut, but you did it for many years with the IDF. And when people outside of Israel see this, and assuming that we have a government after October 27 that would not change this policy, where does that lead Israel down the road?
I think the biggest problem we have is not that the world loses faith in Israel, is that Israel loses faith in the world. And if we don't gauge that, the importance of being part of this global community, the importance of what it means even for business, for summer holidays, or on a practical level. So I'd say my engagements and the people that I'm speaking to in my day job in the Histadrut, they're critical, but we have to listen to the criticism. We need to correct mistakes, but we also need to make sure that they understand what Israel is going through. And the complication of the situation, which is sometimes very hard to transmit in a news report, the complexity of situation, is sometimes lacking perhaps the human element of what it means for me. So I would say Israel needs to be very, very wary of where we're going with regard to relations with the world, with Jewish diaspora. What do we want with this relationship? And I think we need to attune our aspirations together with allies, with people that still love and believe and hope for Israel, and also understand that we won't meet everybody's expectation. But the knee-jerk response that the world is always going to be against us
anyway. So it doesn't
anyway.
matter, yeah.
Therefore, we don't need to do anything, and therefore we can ignore. And therefore, if you ignore, you continue to do these types of policies. And if you do these types of policies, it just brings you back to the circle, back to point one. So I'd say no. We have the ability to change. We have to dictate what vision we want for the state of Israel. How do we do that? Put the right note in the election.
Well, let's hope. Peter, thank you for coming. Abby, thank you for your important reporting and for joining the podcast. It was a fascinating and important conversation. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's it for today's episode. Thanks to our producer and editor, Adi Shacham. If you want to continue watching or listening to the podcast and make sure that you never miss an episode, please subscribe on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast. And of course, to keep up with all the latest news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, don't forget to subscribe and follow Haaretz.com.